All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Fire is Central, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Craig Meyer, and I'm the coordinator of the Tallgrass, Prairie, and Oak Savanna Fire Science Exchange. I'll be the panel's moderator today. Fire is Central is produced through a collaboration between TPOS and the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange. Both organizations are part of the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network, and our mission is to support the use of science to make good decisions about fire management. There are 15 regional members of this network, with our two regions focused on grasslands at the center of the continent, and we're using Fire as Central to highlight grassland fire management issues. Next, I'd like to introduce Lori Bamerlin from the Great Plains.
Hi, I'm Lori Bierlin. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange. I'll be monitoring chat and entering useful links that the speakers are referencing.
Okay, thanks, Lori. Before I introduce today's panelists, I'm going to go over some general guidelines that will support today's webinar and the recording. So microphones and video are off for everyone other than the panelists to help us avoid accidental interruptions with a group of this size. As questions or resources come to mind, please share those in the chat box. As Lori mentioned, she'll be sharing a lot of links throughout this, but if you have relevant links to share as well, that would be great. As you'll hear later, we will be asking our panelists to describe what capacity means to them. Following up on the chat can be fairly rapid sometimes. And so if you find this distracting, please feel free to close the chat during the presentation. I myself am not looking at the chat. It can be very distracting. So you can also save the chat at the end of the presentation before you close Zoom. And we'll also make that available with resources going out after the webinar along with the recording. And then a short evaluation survey will open in your browser when the Zoom meeting closes. And this questionnaire will give participants a chance to share feedback on the presentation. And we also want to continue to hear your suggestions for future topics for the Fire Essential series. And so just to give everyone a little bit of a roadmap with the topics, because I know people, this is going to be a free-flowing discussion, but we do have topics that we've talked about beforehand and main points that we're all prepared to hit. So we're going to talk about what capacity means, because that's an important part of this conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about common misconceptions about private landowners and how to develop private landowner trainings. And then likewise, common misconceptions or questions from private landowners about trainings and how to get involved with prescribed burns on their land. And we're also going to talk about how we can ensure landowners are getting good training, not only for new burners, but then also for people as they can to advance. And we should have some time at the end for questions that are coming in from both registration and today's chat. So with those items covered, we're going to meet our presenters. First up, we have Brian Teeter. He's the Nebraska Prescribed Fire Coordinating Wildlife Biologist from Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. Okay, take it away, Brian.
All right, thanks, Greg. Yeah, so my name is Brian Teeter, Prescribed Fire Coordinator in Nebraska. A little bit about myself. So I always tell the story of my my first experience with fire, and it's kind of a weird loop that kind of goes back to kind of maybe how I got interested in this and got into the conservation world. But when I was a kid, I was maybe 10, 12 years old, somewhere around there. My dad actually went out to burn off a little patch of grass. And, when we got out there, we ended up having to call the fire department. It got away from us. And obviously looking back on it now, he had no plan. We had no equipment, no resources to contain it. And he probably didn't know what he was doing, or obviously he didn't know what he was doing. But that was kind of my first experience with fire. But as a child growing up in Iowa, I spent a lot of time outdoors. But I didn't really realize or recognize, things with conservation that I do now. Prior to 2004, when I first entered college, I knew very little or nothing about grasslands. Like my entire idea of nature was woodlands. So that was kind of a change for me. And I also knew nothing about prescribed fire. Any smoke that I ever saw on the landscape, I immediately thought was a wildfire or something that was associated negatively. And that obviously changed when I got into school. A mentor of mine, Steve Atherton at Kirkwood, he really pressed on the grasslands and the use of prescribed fire. And of course, as I continued my education, those things became more ingrained. And then in 2010, I got accepted a job here in Nebraska as a farm bill biologist, primarily working with landowners developing habitat. And of course, prescribed fire was one of the main components of this new job. And so I kind of literally got thrown into the fire, and we were on burns quite a bit early on. And then in 2015, I became the Nebraska Prescribed Fire Coordinator, where my job is currently. And if you go to the next slide there, Greg. Essentially, my job now is, the way I see it, is more of like a cultural development around prescribed fire and applying prescribed fire on a landscape. And it has different, components to it. And, you see from this graph, the outreach, working with kids, getting them the idea of grasslands and prescribed fire, education when it comes to educating landowners, training landowners. I also work with the Nebraska Prescribed Fire Council quite a bit. We are pretty unique in our Prescribed Fire Council as one of the only 100% landowner-led fire councils in the country, which is pretty cool. We also develop programs and tools. We have, we work with VFDs. We have cost share programs. We develop tools like our Arc Pyro tool or lessons learned. We also provide equipment across the state. We've got over 17 trailers, close to 40 skid units, lots of drip torches that we put out there, work heavily with prescribed burn associations on their development. And then of course, we also do a lot of burn planning in the field as well. So.
All right, thank you, Brian. We'll get back to a lot of those topics through the rest of the conversation, and now I'll switch it over to Morgan.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Like Craig mentioned, my name is Morgan Treadwell. I am an extension range specialist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and I'm based out in San Angelo in West Texas. So think College Station, which is where my faculty is housed at, but then think about 4 hours west of there, and you'll see me in San Angelo. My appointment is 100% extension, and so I'm able to work pretty closely with producers and prescribed burn associations. I like to tell my graduate students that the producers are my students. They're just a little bit more ornery probably than your typical undergrad class, but still it's a really cool opportunity to converge on how fire, grazing, and drought impacts our grasslands, savannas, and especially from just a West Texas flare. So Craig, I can't tell, do you have our slides pulled up or?
Yes, Morgan, I can see him.
Oh, you can see him. Okay, well, for some reason I can't. That's weird. Okay. Must be my view. Okay, well, going and clicking onto that next slide, like Craig mentioned, and then also Brian mentioned too, what was our first experience, or how did you get into prescribed fire? And I apologize for those that have seen this slide before. But my first experience was with my dad. Dad worked as a range conservationist for the USDA Forest Service in Ruidoso on the Lincoln National Forest. And that's where we were raised. And so every summer, you know, Dad fought fires, and he was on more fire duty and more fire assignments. And so every summer that was just what was the norm in my house. And so I shared a few postcards of my first interactions with fire behavior, or descriptions of fire behavior or smoke management. A lot of the times Dad would describe what it was like, you know, in those days they packed mules in to get supplies up to the fire line. And so with my dad's range background, that's a majority of what he did on that Yellowstone fire. But he was there for most of the summer and into the fall, probably until the first snows came. And he called it an easy job, but he also really enjoyed it. And the folks that he met there, and the relationships that he created there, and the network he built, lasted throughout his entire 37-year career with the Forest Service, fighting fires. And of course, he met a lot more people on the fire line after that too. So I come from a Forest Service background and a Forest Service family. And Craig, you can click to that next slide. And in fact, that's what I pursued, because I thought that was in my blood, and that was what the family business was. My brother does, in fact, still work for the U.S. Forest Service on the Prescott National Forest. He literally took a page out of Dad's book, and he's a range con for, you know, during the day, and then he fights fires in the summer and goes out on fire assignments when his wife and his 3 boys will let him. But that Forest Service family runs deep, and it's kind of a cool lead into my prescribed fire experience. I paid my tuition and all my undergrad fees at Utah State University from my fire paychecks that I earned during the summer. And so I spent a lot of time on the Dixie National Forest and the Fish Lake and Wasatch Cache National Forest throughout Utah. But then I kind of just started realizing, like, hey, this is cool, and we can use fire as a tool and as a process instead of just putting them out and suppressing them. And so I found myself to what was called a fire use module, and that was kind of the early days of those fire use crews. And after I spent one summer on that fire use module, I thought, to heck with this. I'm going to go study it to see how I can use and explore it more. And that led me to my PhD in the northern mixed grass prairie and parts of Fargo, right outside of Fargo at North Dakota State University, and then eastern Montana at the USDA ARS lab at Fort Keogh. After I was there, I thought, hey, I'm burning in northern mixed grass prairie. I need to go to the southeast, because that's where a lot of the prescribed fire was at, right? And so I did a couple of stints at the Prescribed Fire Training Center there in Tallahassee, Florida, and just really developed an appreciation for the way that fire was meticulously calculated and prescribed in numerous different plant communities. So from forested timber systems to mixed grass prairie and tallgrass prairie. Burning grass, though, is still my favorite, even though you can carry the same type of fire in those forested systems. So going to that next slide, my journey is definitely from a range background. My bachelor's is in ag communications and animal science. And then from there, I really got serious about studying range, particularly the intersection of fire, grazing, and drought, and what that means for producers and ranchers. I started with my position with AgriLife Extension in 2014. So I've been roughly doing this for about 10 years, which is really, really weird. But I enjoy it and I love it. And if I wasn't doing it as part of an education or an extension component, I'd be doing it on my own with my husband and my family in Schlacker and Menard counties, just south of San Angelo. And so my research and extension program really is all about the producer. That's my end user. You know, how can I make the research more accessible? How can I put it in more meaningful ways for producers? And how can I build resiliency for our producers to maintain profitability and sustainability when they're living in a drought, but still need to manage woody plant encroachment and still need to have strong, resilient, tough native perennial grasses that are the core forage base for their calf operation, or even small ruminant sheep and goat operation. So that intersection of fire, grazing, and drought is just a huge cornerstone. And from there, we dive into soil health conversations. We dive into brush management. You know, how can we work with mechanical or even herbicide operations to restore the function and integrity of those processes, that is fire, grazing, and drought. And so we try to tackle that in a lot of different ways, because folks all learn differently, right? So we do a lot of online work where there's asynchronous learning occurring. I had producers coming and telling me, like, Morgan, I want to come to your 3-day in-person class. I can't be away from my headquarters, my place, for that long a time. How can I learn your content but not have to leave home? And so that really was the catalyst for putting a lot of this stuff online. But that being said, I understand the importance of sitting in a classroom and learning firsthand from folks like Brian Teeter, who routinely guest lectures in my burn schools, and even Andy McCready, who's also on here as well. So that face-to-face in-person learning is extremely important and very valuable, and still a crucial part of my research and range program. And so going to that next slide, Craig, a lot of my stuff is also via available social media. So on Twitter or on Facebook, and that QR code is a link to my blog as well. Lori just put in the chat information on the Prairie Project. Prairie Project is a really cool project that encompasses the Great Plains, where there's a lot more resources devoted to educators, extension folks, all within the realm of prescribed fire, multi-species grazing, patch burn grazing, and pirate herbivory. So thank you so much to Craig and Lori for hosting us. And I really just get to hang out with friends on these webinars. So it's pretty cool. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Morgan. Next, we're going to see if we can switch over to Jen Fawcett. She had a fire alarm going off right as we were starting the webinar. So let's see if everything is going here.
Yeah, I think I'm on track now. The timing could not have been worse. Or I guess it could have been during the webinar, so maybe it could have been. But
Yeah,
I mean,
thank you so much.
yeah, it's all about fire today, right? So it's only appropriate that there's a fire drill right in the middle of it. Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. Like Morgan said, it's like joining friends, and it's nice to see a good crowd on today. So I'm Jen Fawcett. I work as an extension wildland fire specialist at North Carolina State Extension that is based on campus in Raleigh, North Carolina. My role is 100% fire position. I dabble in some other women's forestry programming and some chainsaw workshops, stuff, but what I do is related to wildland fire in some way or another. So as a little bit of background as to how I got in fire, you can go back to the other slide. I was going to touch on there. So I grew up in Delaware, which is most people tell me that they've never met anybody from Delaware before. So now you have. I grew up in a family that wasn't particularly outdoorsy, but I was kind of the only one looking for frogs and bugs, and just really liked being outside. And so I ended up going to school at the University of Delaware because I also liked animals. And just like Morgan, I got a degree in animal science while I was there. But I ended up taking a lot of classes in wildlife conservation, and that kind of really captivated me a little bit more. So I decided to go that route. And then while I was in school, I was working at the Philadelphia Zoo as an outreach educator. I did a lot of outreach and education with the people visiting the zoo and in school systems there. And in Philadelphia, not a lot of people get to see some of the animals other than at the zoo, that we're learning about their habitats and talking about, you know, the needs of the type of habitat these animals needed. And so that's when I first really learned about fire as part of the ecosystem, was in that role. And so I moved to Florida after that job to work as an ecologist in Southwest Florida, and kind of continued pursuing my love for wildlife, did a lot of wildlife surveys. And that's when I got to see fire on the ground as part of that ecosystem. I had never participated in a burn myself at that point, but at some point along the road, I decided I wanted to go back to grad school. So I went to Clemson University for a degree in forest management. And that last picture there of me holding the drip torch was my very first ever burn. There's some experimental forest there at Clemson, and it was part of some research that we were doing. And so they asked me if I wanted to hold the drip torch, and I said yes, and then I was hooked after that. So that was literally my first burn over that you see there, big smile on my face. And so after that, that just kind of changed the trajectory of my entire career. So after that, I was kind of job searching after school, and I saw an opening for what is now my current positions. You can go to the next slide. And that was really, it started as an education and outreach position, which I kind of already had a lot of experience in that. But it was a little bit different in that it was really focused on fire, and especially in longleaf pine at that range. And I didn't know anything. I knew a little bit about longleaf from my graduate work and some research I had done, but I really learned most of what I do now on the job. And I've been here for almost 12 years now. So that first picture is the oldest longleaf pine, the oldest known living longleaf pine, and it is in North Carolina. It's 476 years old now, I believe, something like that. And ever since then, I've been just doing a lot of education and outreach. Burner Bob is kind of our new southeastern prescribed fire mascot. Not to replace Smokey, but he's friends with Smokey Bear. And I've been able to go out on a lot of prescribed burns, lead a lot of training, work with that picture in the middle, working with the Prescribed Burn Association, with the Sandhills Prescribed Burn Association in North Carolina, very PBA. You'll probably hear me talk a lot about PBAs today, because that too kind of changed the trajectory of my life, because now I'm actually studying PBAs for my doctorate work. And that's a big part of what I've spent my time on the last several years. So, and there's me with my son on his first ever burn. I'll stop there. Oh, and then just to mention, yeah, if you wanted to go to, we do have a website with some more information. That RepiMap is just showing kind of all the different military installations, because a lot of people don't necessarily connect the military with fire. But that's most of what I do, is working with the military and state and federal natural resource agencies to all work collaboratively on trying to get more good fire on the ground. But that also includes maintaining habitat on private lands, of course. And so on our website, we have a lot of information for that group, but also just general information about prescribed burn associations. There's a map that Carol Baldwin and others maintain. We have the Drip Torch Digest newsletter, which is a newsletter completely focused on prescribed fire in the southern region, and just lots of other resources. So I would encourage you to check out that website. Thanks, Greg, and thanks for having me today.
All right. Thank you so much. So we transitioned here to the discussion. I think all of the different backgrounds that you have here hopefully bodes well for our ability to build more capacity in the future. You're all coming from different areas. So one thing I'll just mention for the audience, a lot of us are dealing with viruses and allergies and other things. So if we need to go off camera for a minute, that is what's going on there. Okay, so shifting into our questions, we definitely wanted to make sure we're aware of different categories of capacity, because it's really a wiggle word that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so specifically when we're talking about private landowners, that might expand what that means beyond agencies or NGOs as well. So Morgan, if you could kick us off and tell us about what capacity means in your scope of work.
Yeah, so in my scope of work, capacity has changed definitions from like not only from year to year, but season to season, and then also just throughout the entire duration that I've been in West Texas. And I've seen kind of that trend cascade up and down the Great Plains, the corridor really. It's kind of cool because I can talk to Brian, or I can talk to Lori or John in Oklahoma, and I can run them past what I'm dealing with, and they'll be like, oh yeah, we had that same kind of thing maybe 5 years ago, and this is how we worked through it. And it always kind of comes back to those different definitions of capacity. And you know, when I first started on the job, you told me capacity, and I'm like thinking, heck yeah, equipment and people and training and experience. kind of those more traditional terms of what capacity is. But now, as I've seen the environment change, as I've seen it change within a matter of weeks, like for example, in Angelo, we went from like really intensive drought over the summer to 12 inches of rain in 1 month. So we hit our annual average in 1 month, and that switch between extremes is crazy. Well, guess what? Our fuels respond that same way too. And so capacity is also a really good description for our fuels and our changing fuel environment. You know, how we fight fires, how we line up a prescription for even prescribed fire, that's all different. And that's all rapidly changing based on the fuel structure and the dynamic that we're dealing with. And, you know, as quickly as things as change here in terms of receiving rainfall, things can also change just as quickly in terms of drying out and in terms of frontal movement. And it's just a kind of a moving target. So the capacity to recognize that moving target in our vegetation and in our fuels, I think is a people thing. But, you know, we also have to tip our hat to the fuels and the vegetation and the native plant communities that we're dealing with, because that capacity also changes on that. You know, the capacity to hold water, release water, just the energy punched into those fuels. Factor in invasive species, KR bluestem, that type of grass is going to burn a heck of a lot more differently than our native species. So it's a layering, complex definition to capacity. And as plant people, as rangeland people, as fire people, we have to think about it in terms of, yes, the social dynamic, the people dynamic, but also our fuels and our vegetation as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for connecting that back into the fire regime as well. So I'll either flip it to Brian or Jennifer for the follow-up.
I'll go. I just wrote down, you know, kind of, you know, when you posed this question to us, you know, for the pre-meeting, I kind of thought about it a little bit, but I kind of wrote down basically capacity for me is having the infrastructure and the ability to help people in the land asking for it, similar to kind of what Morgan was really talking about. You know, and I think there's several layers of capacity. You know, there's a layer of capacity for the NGOs and government, and then there's also capacity at the local level from prescribed burn associations. So, you know, when we ask the question, it's like, do we have the capacity at our government or NGO level, the professional type level, and then versus the PBA? And I think, you know, we could go in and talk about those things in a little more depth, but you know, I think at those levels, you know, there's a lot of interesting dynamics and things that I see on the landscape on a, you know, daily basis that, you know, are we able to keep up with those things? Are we meeting those targets? And those targets are always changing, kind of, I think what Morgan was saying. You know, and sometimes those priorities focus or change for landowners and for, you know, the broader conservation organizations. And so the ability to keep up with all of those and manage all of those things, to me, is kind of where I'm sitting at with the kind of capacity question. And I think that, you know, if you ask me about whether the capacity is where we need it to be, I don't think so. But, you know, it's kind of, I always liken it to that, you know, if we could all just snap our fingers and do what needs to be done on the landscape, you know, that would be great. But it's kind of this long process that, you know, taking our culture from a place of where we went from Smokey the Bear to Burner Bob, you know, it's that continuous process of keep pushing and implementing and getting that culture back on the landscape so that the people are taken care of and land is also taken care of.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that a little bit. And I know everybody on the line probably has their own thoughts as to what capacity means to them. One thing that I've really thought about is, you know, we always talk about the need for more fire, and a big part of that is capacity in terms of just the sheer number of people and resources to be able to do that. There's never been any sort of study, at least that I'm aware of, where we know exactly how much fire we need on an annual basis, and any, maybe at a local level, but at the landscape level, sometimes it's really hard to know how much prescribed fire is needed and how many people and resources that will truly take. So I agree with Brian, we're probably not there. I think there's still a lot of capacity that's still needed. Just in terms of personnel, I think having trained individuals who not only understand the behavior and the ecology, but they also have the skills to conduct those burns safely and effectively, making sure we have enough of those people out there. So that includes everyone, from experienced burn bosses all the way to support roles. We need all of those positions filled. So even somebody who hasn't, maybe it's their first burn, but I think there's still a role for them, and there's still a need for as many people and as many resources out there. The need for the right level of training, experience, the understanding of local condition, place where they live. And then of course, funding and resources, that's kind of an obvious form of a need for capacity, but it's really important, because having reliable funding for equipment and gear and people, and especially since prescribed burning requires kind of like specialized tools and specialized training, so to make sure all of that is accounted for. For public agencies, it often includes like grant and budget allocations, right? But on private landowners, it might involve different funding sources like cost share programs or financial incentives. So just making sure that all of those resources are in place for private landowners. And then the last thing I would probably add on to what Morgan and Brian have already said is capacity in terms of social acceptance and community and stakeholder support. So especially on private lands, capacity includes the support of the broader community who might be impacted or benefit from the burns. So this could involve additional outreach and education and advocating for policy support that allows landowners to engage and prescribe burns safely. So kind of all of those things combined, I think capacity seems like an easy word to answer, but there's just so much involved.
Yeah, and I think that, when you talk about capacity from like a personnel standpoint, just people standpoint, when you think about most conservation practices or anything that we do for land management, many of the things that we do, we can do by ourselves or with our, friends or family, but prescribed fire is one of those unique things where it takes a whole village to get it done. And so having that village or trying to build that village, it does take a certain individual personality. Kind of go into the PBAs. It takes a certain individual or a certain group of people to build that village. It's something that I think we lost over the course of the last 50, 60 years, the sense of community. But you realize that when those areas that do have that sense of community and build that village are usually always the ones that are applying the most fire on the ground.
And Craig, really quickly too, before we, escape or I guess move on from the capacity question. I think capacity is definitely the most relevant when one considers the complexity of the grassland biome. And I think that's, a really good consideration as we experience fragmentation, urbanization, and then of course, renewable energy inevitably impacting the entire corridor, north to south.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you really touched on a lot of the different dimensions, and like to summarize these and send them out as well. We're going to be talking about this at the Burning Issues Workshop in Michigan coming up in February, and that'll be available virtually as well. So hopefully we can continue these discussions. And since we began planning for this, the Fire Learning Network has also put out a publication on this based on some survey work. So we'll make sure to put that in the resources as well. So yeah, definitely dynamic and fragmentation has been a huge issue as well in terms of making burning more complex and harder. One last comment is as well, anyone who can make it to one of the Nebraska Prescribed Fire Council meetings, I think there's, along with other states, but Nebraska's been really great to see the private landowner leadership there that Brian was talking about. So great case studies there.
And someone tells me they got really cool swag this year too. You know, from stickers to shirts with different colors too. You can't beat that, Brian.
Awesome. All right, well, we'll keep moving along here. The other thing we wanted to talk about is, people have a lot of ideas about private landowners. Especially for those of us who haven't had a chance to work directly with them. So wanted to talk about any misconceptions or new lessons that you've taken away from working in this field with the private landowners. So Jen, could you lead us off in the discussion there?
Sure. Yeah, so in extension, we work with private landowners quite a bit, especially at the county level. And it's really important to just keep in mind their needs and their considerations and resources, and making sure that we're doing right by them and providing them with all the resources that they need. And a lot of times, the research that's done goes into a journal article, and there's really good information out there, but that's as far as it goes. So we try to take that information, the research that's been done, do needs assessment, talk to the landowners, do interviews, find out from them what do they truly need. And then it might involve a synthesis of the research and putting it, putting out into the hands of the people who are the ones on the ground managing their land. So I would say, there are some misconceptions about private landowners and training. And I would say some of those include that private landowners may be too inexperienced or don't care enough to manage fire responsibly, and that's just not true. There's that assumption that they maybe lack the interest or the skill to handle burns safely, but in reality, many landowners are really deeply invested in the health of their land. They're really motivated to learn proper techniques. So with the right training and support, they can be just as knowledgeable and responsible as agency professionals, sometimes if not more so, because it's their own land at stake. It's their own land that they're trying to manage and take care of. Another thing that comes up sometimes is that private landowners only want the basic information. We've had lots of requests in the past for kind of some more advanced, there are some people, everybody's kind of on a spectrum of where they are in terms of their land management. Some truly are just starting out, and the really basic information would be appropriate for them. But we've had a lot of requests for people who kind of want that advanced next step. So, the people who are putting on those training programs, I would, say just keep that in mind, that since everybody's on a spectrum, it would be what we've been able to do is use a method where you kind of advertise and market to those specific audiences. So thinking about the beginners, have like a very make it very clear this is a beginner's workshop, or this is an intermediate or advanced workshop. And some of those training programs aren't always familiar with different adult learning principles, and so keeping that in mind too. So that's been a big part of it's actually what I'm doing my doctorate work on, is adult learning principles and fire training programs. And just keeping it in mind that a lot of the trainings that are being put on for private landowners have that experiential learning. That's a really important part of adult learning. Adults have a lot of experience that they can also, a lot of people on this call right now have tons of fire experience. And so that peer-to-peer connection, and giving people the opportunity with that experience to then share that with somebody else who's a little bit more inexperienced, and vice versa. And just finding out, what motivates people, why are they coming to these events? Why are they motivated to burn their land? Economics, people think economics are sometimes the biggest motivator for people to burn their land, but really, I worked with several people on the line today that I see some names on here. We did a study of prescribed burn associations across the country and asked them why, what was their major objective for burning. In a lot of cases, it was it was fuels reduction and wildlife habitat and invasive species control and a lot of these other reasons. And so if you can find the reasons why people want to burn and then gear the trainings towards those motivations, there's some opportunities, I think, for some specific training opportunities there. And also letting people know that training's not only for the professionals. Some landowners might think, training's only for professionals. They hear about these NWCG courses. And so I think that's why it's really important for us to have non-NWCG courses to make sure that there's opportunities for everybody to get training. It's not only for firefighters or agency staff. So there's some of those training programs are specifically tailored for private landowners, and they really emphasize the practical skills that people are going to need when they get out on the ground.
Yeah, quick follow-up. I was just curious with the involvement of private landowners. Are you seeing then any of them become involved as in providing training as well, or is that something that might happen in the future?
Yeah, I would say at a basic level, I think all of them at some point. So when we asked that survey that I mentioned, that national survey, we asked the PBAs, how do you provide training for your members? And over 70% of them said every burn is a training burn. And I think that's not only the people in charge necessarily of leading the PBAs. I think a lot of that too is that peer-to-peer conversations I was talking about. So they may not know that they're not a trainer on paper necessarily, but I think everybody has that role to play and has experience and knowledge that they can pass on. And then some people have gone on to become formal mentors. We have people working with the PBAs now who are formal mentors. Some of them get paid for that work. Some of them have become PBA coordinators. We do have some people who are now assisting in North Carolina. We have what's called the Certified Burn Manager Program. So a lot of states have these Certified Burn Manager programs. In North Carolina, ours is a hybrid course. The online part is kind of in the classroom online. And then the field day, some of our landowners have actually helped lead some of those field days. We do them all across the state. And so they've participated at that level too. So they're not only using it on the ground, but they're then taking it and training others in some cases.
Yeah, I'd add to that, a lot of people, they may not see themselves as like a trainer or a mentor, but on all the burns I go on to, you just see it, like the people that, when they're out doing fire, they're training people whether they realize it or not. And it's kind of cool to see. And one of the things that we've done this year, we're actually doing two different, at our state fire conference, we're doing kind of a train the trainer session that's going to be kind of focused on like how do we become better at it, how do we become more purposeful about doing that on the fire line, because we see it all the time just happening without people even realizing it. And then the other one, we're doing another online webinar in February, I believe, about how to do that, how to train on the fire line. What are some of the things that you can actually do to increase that level of training? Whether it's like, it's annoying when people talk on the radio too much, but people don't realize that when you talk on the radio, others are listening. So if you lay out your thought process on making a decision, others hear that, and then in the back of their mind, they don't know they're being trained necessarily, but they hear that, and then they can apply that maybe on the next burn or in the next situation that needs to be thought through. So I think there's a lot of, I wouldn't say misconception necessarily, but, I think that, the different levels of training that happen, whether it's, in the classroom or on the fire line, every burn is a training burn. It's always a common phrase that we use. But I think we are trying to become more intentional about implementing that when we are doing our fires.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was one streamlined way to teach, right? And it was the same way every single time. And as we're learning more and more about our new audience, our new landowners, it's kind of taken more of a shotgun approach. And so I don't know if that's the right way to do it or the best way to approach it. But I do know when I can offer a little bit for everyone and still somehow maintain some unique tailoring of like, okay, well, this group is right outside of DFW Metro. So they're going to need a lot more smoke, or they're going to, you know, or they're more fragmented, or more small acreage landowners, or whatever. So we still maintain some, you know, kind of uniqueness and some identity with the specialization of training that you offer. But as far as I have learned, all sorts of approaches increases that capacity. So yeah, you might upset a few people and like, hey man, this is way too basic for me. I need something way more advanced. But it's like, okay, well then you're gonna have to catch me, you know, a couple months from now, or catch us on our advanced class. So offering a buffet of choices, right? Variety is the spice of life. And as we're seeing more people learn about fire, they're going to inevitably be at more different learning levels. Not everybody's in the same place at the same time, and not everyone's burning for the same reasons. So the more choices we can offer for learning, both online, in person, hybrid, you know, out on a fire, in front of a PowerPoint, looking at weather, all of it, I think it's moving the ball off the scrimmage line. And at the end of the day, that's what matters to me, is you know, that's the impact. I don't know if it's the right way though.
And Morgan, you also mentioned new landowners or different demographics coming into the sphere. So are you also it sounds like it's pretty dynamic. So you're having to update your kind of idea of who's burning and why.
Yeah.
So are you feeling like your conceptions are kind of continuously challenged there too?
Man, Craig, we can't keep up with them. Like that's how quickly it's changing. And I don't think it's just a Texas thing or a Southern Great Plains thing. I think we're seeing this across rural landscapes and rural communities entirely. I mean, you go down to the grocery store, feed store, post office, it's not the same people that you used to see all the different time. I mean, and that's cool. That's and all of them are still interested in prescribed fire. They're not bringing negative baggage or misconceptions to the table. They genuinely want to learn, and they want to do it right. And you know, I think there's a lot of different definitions to conservation out there and reasons for burning. And at the end of the day, you know, fire's fire. It's the process, it's a tool. And I think the fact that they are open-minded about it is really cool. But yeah, it's exploding at rates that we can't keep up in terms of new information, in terms of laws and regs. I mean, those things in Texas change way too often for my liking. And it's also splintering too. So we're seeing different complexities for smoke at state and federal levels. We're seeing different layers of complexity and laws and regs and liability, different practitioners, different, you know, practitioners. All right, you're a rancher burning your own private property. Here's the set of rules you have to play by. You're a commercial burn manager licensed from our state agency. Here's your set of rules to play by. Oh, and it's not just liability, it's also smoke. And then there's certified and insured. Yeah, and then there's lead burn instructors as well teaching these courses. So there's just a lot to keep up with. And I think we're doing a good job, but then it kind of comes back to capacity too, and that ability to adapt, to read the situation, almost to be situationally aware of what you're dealing with and the audience that you're dealing with, to make sure that you're delivering the right information at the right time for those right reasons.
Yeah, and I think the capacity part of that, you know, when we get to a point where, you know, our capacity, as people that are pushing fire on a daily basis, you know, can't keep up with everybody. Sometimes hard decisions have to be made about where that capacity is going to be directed at. You know, one landscape versus another landscape, you know, a different area. And that could be that's challenging on us, because in an ideal world, I'd love to help every single person burn or learn how to burn. But that's just not the case with our current capacity, just because of the complexities of all that. You know, we put out all of our, you know, trainings and workshops, and where you're helping on the fire line and stuff like that. But, you know, you can only be in so many places at once. But I do think, I don't know where or when it happened, but we are also, seeing that realization on the landscape that people are wanting to implement fire on the landscape and are needing more assistance. But the good news is that in areas where, some people, they're doing it on their own, they don't really need our help, and that's great. And then other times we have prescribed burn associations that we kind of help prop up and give them what they need, help them along, hold their hand. And after a couple, 3, 4 years, sometimes they don't need us any longer, and they come to us when they need help. We have those relationships with them that, we're there when they need our help. And then, but they kind of get to a point where they take on the mentorship role of people next door or in another county that are, needing assistance. And so by adding capacity and transferring that capacity to those private landowners, we're building capacity on the ground that way as well, which is fantastic.
I did want to touch on something that Morgan said, because she brought up liability, and it also showed up. Brian made a really good point in the chat about, liability is a big issue for landowners, and PBAs are a really good resource to help. The liability concerns, liability oftentimes comes up as the number one or very close to the top, reasons that people aren't burning. And the liability concerns are real for sure, but sometimes they're, exaggerated. But the people may think that there's more liability than there truly is. Morgan and I wrote a paper with John Weir and others on this a few years ago. And, a lot of times there's protections for people who are trained, who have training and experience. So those certified burn manager programs, a lot of times, as long as you're a certified burner and you're following your state guidelines and those sorts of things, you would be covered from a liability perspective. I put a link in the chat. It does only cover the southern states, so I apologize for those of you not in the South, but we worked with some lawyers to take a comprehensive look at what each of the state laws and regulations are, and then what a landowner would actually be liable for. So, and I know Morgan had I know there were some additions to the Texas section of that document, but there are some resources out there on liability. And I think, thinking about reducing your risk of liability, the more capacity you have with trained and experienced people on the fire line, the more knowledge you have out there. There's also insurance options to help with some of that, but the more training experienced people you have, your liability risk is going to go down, because now you have a proven people there who have gotten that education and training that they need. They have the hands-on experience. You had enough people in the fire line. You did all the correct things. So just wanted to throw that out there. And prescribed burn associations, Brian's right, is a really great way, because they can very easily provide a lot of the things that help to minimize that risk of liability. And there's also some funding. Yeah, I don't know. We can chat if people want to add, other people in the one line also want to talk about funding in the chat box for PBAs, because there's a lot of options out there to help with funding of those things for sure.
Yeah, and we can definitely add some more resources on liability as well, since that does vary so much from state to state. But that's a really interesting correlation you bring up with the increasing capacity to reduce your liability. One thing I did want to try to follow up on quickly was, Jen, I think you had mentioned that there might be a perception that training is only to like NWCG standards among landowners. And I was wondering for Morgan or Brian if you hear similar things in your regions.
Yeah, I mean, the whole NWCG versus just, kind of private landowner training, that's always a exciting conversation to have, and it's always one that comes up too. I think if you make it an issue, or you make it a point to, segregate out, then it's going to be an issue. In Texas, I think we're doing a pretty strong, I guess, approach. and saying, yeah, there's NWCG and there's private landowner and our certification process from the state. But at the end of the day, it's all the same people together. I mean, and I think that's really cool too. There's a mutual understanding of just fire, period, and especially prescribed fire too. And I think the more we can just kind of have those conversations, we can still be in our, our uniforms or our denim or whatever, with the understanding of how fire is being applied from what practitioner. But a lot of times, I see a lot of landowners go into NWCG classes because they specifically want that information. And more importantly, they want the same information that the guys that they're working with on the fire line are getting. So everybody's talking the same language, the universal language of what is fire out there. And then I see that on vice versa too, on the flip side, where NWCG guys, yeah, they want to come to a burn school for landowners, and they want to sit side by side with those landowners so they see what they're learning. And they see how they're approaching prescribed fire on their property. And they also want that basic understanding of liability too, as well, and insurance. And so at the end of the day, I think everybody wants to speak that same language. At points in time, yeah, you can put it on of like, hey, this isn't more of an NWCG centric or more private landowner. But I think we're getting down to the nuts and bolts of just fire, and recognizing that, the challenges that face NWCG guys are also those same challenges that face our private landowners.
I think some of you are probably familiar with my thoughts on NWCG, but I always go back to that, it's not necessarily that, I think the NWCG classes, again, like Morgan was just saying, essentially that information, it's all good information. And I think that we have to separate NWCG certification process from the NWCG content in their classes. Because there's great content in those classes, and some of the classes are heavily on some of the processes of, the federal government or state government, how they implement NWCG, task books and stuff like that. But the content is great, right? I mean, most of our programs, prescribed fire programs, basically stole content from prescribed fire because it is one and the same. And so I believe, that training, and again, a lot of our landowners, some of them will take it, but when you talk about that certification process, some of them already, they have that kind of knee-jerk reaction of like, no, we don't want NWCG because they're afraid of the potential ramifications of implementation of the certification NWCG to their, private landowners, versus maybe just the training side of it. And I think there's kind of a disconnect sometimes, and that's partially due to just some of the, publicity around that NWCG.
Yeah, and if there's a specific topic, that people are interested in, we have had requests, especially on smoke. So there was one of our PBAs here, actually a few of our PBAs have now had smoke specific training, and it was basically it was taking the NWCG content, some of it, and just shifting it, with some of that more experiential training, less of the the federal language and the acronyms and some of those things, and just making it more geared towards landowners and without worrying about the certification, since they didn't need that. But yeah, a lot of good topics to pull from some of those courses for sure.
And I think all that curriculum from NWCG is available. Like you can find that curriculum online for free. I think and if you want hard copies of like the classes on DVDs or PowerPoints or CDs, you can request it, and it's pretty reasonable to purchase too. So ways to not reinvent the wheel for sure when it's a lot of the same information.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about those examples of overlap too between the private landowners and folks who are in the NWCG program, and just how much is relevant for both. And talking about that, and in addition to the differences between the two, I think is really interesting to highlight. Just I have one more question, and then we have some time to get to questions that came in from the registration and the chat before we wrap up here. We've talked a little bit already about ensuring landowners are getting good training and having a progression of training, and just was interested in like based on your experiences, are there best management practices that you would suggest in terms of like planning out trainings, or again, is it just like a very dynamic process where you need to learn as you go if you're new to this?
Go ahead,
Yeah, I
Brian.
think, yeah, from Nebraska standpoint, I think we started, roughly in about 2008 or 9, but ever since then, we kind of came up with a sort of program where, we have our really kind of basic online or basic workshop. We call it Introductory to Prescribed Fire, where essentially it's a 6 or 7 hour course where we basically dive into, prescribed fire from A to Z. It's all classroom based. But we really like that because it gives people kind of a foundation to utilize when they actually get out in the field. Because basically the next step of our process is that we typically don't do a lot of like, hey, we're going to come burn, a couple acres and show you how to do the process. Because we don't really have the capacity or didn't have the capacity to really do that. So then we basically get them out on actual prescribed burns. So we're like, hey, if you are interested in burning and you want to burn or learn how to burn, get a hold of us, and we basically send them out on an actual prescribed fire and then go through that kind of training process on the fire line where they're observing and they're kind of tied to a person that knows what's going on, and we can kind of cycle them through different positions on the burn that day or the next day, to really kind of get them going. And we've kind of found that works pretty well. But then we also been doing, other kind of advanced type trainings. So we do about 6 to 8 basic workshops, introductory workshops every year. We've had close to, I don't know, 2,000-3,000 people, I think, go through those courses. And then we do advanced workshops, either online or in person, where we kind of dive into certain topics, whether it's how to be a better burn boss or crew boss, or how to be a better trainer, how to write burn plans. And we'll put those events on throughout the state as well, and people come in. But we've added some capacity in this last year where we're actually able to individually tailor some trainings towards like, specific PBAs or specific areas of where those knowledge is needed. So it includes even like volunteer fire departments that we're starting to go to now as well, where we're actually just going to them saying, what are your very specific needs that we can come in and, a couple hours or whatever it may be to kind of implement that process. And then on top of that, we also have, our prescribed fire conference that we've been putting on. This is our 10th anniversary of it, where it kind of brings together a lot of the burners and landowners burn in to talk about fire and, talk with each other, network with each other, and kind of that process that we've been pushing through. And then of course, there's the science side. A lot of the science, like the Prairie Project, has been doing a lot of great stuff. Oklahoma State, I mean, all those things that in the Great Plains, at least, done a great job pushing out a lot of that science and the needs for burning and stuff. So, we feel like we got a pretty decent system that's in place in terms of training. But, I think there's, one of the things too that we've seen just in the last couple of years is that sometimes we see it on both like the NGO side or government side and the private landowner side, but sometimes people get a little too comfortable with fire. And so just offering these trainings and encouraging people to go just keeps their minds sharp, and, always learning. One of the things that we did implement this last year is we did a prescribed fire lessons learned, where we had people submit content about lessons learned in prescribed burning. And that's been pretty well received in the state, where people are, learning from people's mistakes that they've learned, 10, 15 years ago, and making sure that if you're new to burning, that you're able to, maybe prevent one of those mistakes or one of those issues that somebody's already gone through. And I think that's important to make sure that people are, for advancing prescribed fire, because, whether we like it or not, our margin for errors in putting fire on the landscape are smaller than basically anything else that we're doing on the landscape, because it's much more visible when things go wrong. So anything that we do, any trainings that we do, we're always just with the goal and the mindset of advancing prescribed fire and prescribed fire culture on the landscape, to the point where acceptance from not only neighbors but in larger cities, metropolitan areas, are essentially being accepted.
I just want to say that prescribed fire lessons learned that they created, I think it's really important to have that for landowners specifically, because some of our lessons learned might be a little bit different than what the agencies have experienced. And so I think either conducting a needs assessment to actually ask the people, kind of like I mentioned before, what sort of training they need, or if a lesson came up on one of your burns, right? Maybe that's an area where some training could be provided. So I would say, rather than just trying to guess what sort of training people need, just, really either ask them or find the perceived or true need of what that training might be. So that way you can offer things that people are interested in, because one of the adult learning concepts is this like orientation to learning, and they're more likely to learn when the material is practical and relevant to their lives. So if there was something that had just happened on a burn last week, it could be a little bit more relevant to their life to then go to a training on that topic because they saw it firsthand, something that happened. So just keeping kind of those sorts of things in mind if you're the people conducting the trainings. And I threw a link to in the chat to a guide that Laurel Case and I had created a few years ago. It's primarily for extension and outreach professionals, but really anybody, and just giving some ideas of some of the types of outreach, not necessarily training programs, but just some outreach programs as well.
One of the kind of the coolest feedback sessions I've had from burn schools is from this last one that we did this last summer. Our burn unit felt hard and we had a crappy forecast. And so we had to kind of make some lemonade out of lemons. And so what we did is we set up a series of kind of mini burns. And there was probably 12 different mini burns, and we paired a scenario or a situation with them. So kind of sand table exercise, but we had some creativity with it, and we rotated roles of the participants. So one was a burn boss, one was holding, one was ignitions, and they rotated through those different leadership roles. They had their own little mini crew. They had to line it out. They had to give the briefing. I mean, it was as like hypothetical real as you can make it, in kind of that trainee mentality. And that worked really well because of the different scenarios that we created. One from like a wildfire mitigation standpoint, another one from burning for wildlife, another one for burning under the objective of managing brush and creating as much fire energy as you can. So the previous day they learned ignitions, and so it was all about putting those ignition patterns into action on a really teeny tiny, manageable, underwhelming scale. Sometimes I see folks kind of glaze over when they roll to a burn unit and it's like 500 acres or whatever, and they can't see the other crew or can't see the other side, and their lay of the land is all messed up. This just scaled everything down to a really bite-sized, fun size experience that I think resonated with a lot of folks. And believe it or not, we had NWCG folks there from municipalities, and they loved it. And so it wasn't the most ideal thing. I would have liked to have had a little bit more fuel, and then maybe we could scale it up eventually to where we're traveling, taking a page out of PFTC's book or something like that. But those little mini burns where it's mentally manageable, for someone at that learning level, I think is was really cool. And so I'm looking to integrate that kind of those scenario hypothetical driven situations into my burn experience, probably in future burn schools.
Yeah, there's nothing like stepping into that leadership role for the first time to really get a sense of the big picture. And it's great when you have that small scale to play with.
Yeah.
Well, we are getting closer to the end of our time here. I did have one quick follow-up question on training, and then we might be able to hit one or two more from the chat. But there has been a lot of discussion about the programs and that there's a lot of training going on. And we had a question then about certification of the instructors. And so Morgan, if you have some lessons learned from that process in Texas, and it sounds like Jen had some insights to share there too, for sure.
Yeah, so in Texas, through the Texas Department of Agriculture, in kind of conjunction with our Certified and Insured Prescribed Burn Manager program, we do organize as lead burn instructors, or LBIs for short. You have to become certified to become a lead burn instructor, meaning you're a recognized instructor to teach our 24-hour curriculum course. And that basically, builds out the capacity for those lead burn instructors throughout the state. So I'm one. We've got Andy McCready on here as well. He's also one. Certainly not enough lead burn instructors, but that has allowed for the program to have kind of a universal platform from which we teach. And that curriculum has been reviewed, created, hopefully consistently revised as an organic curriculum that's constantly changing based on what we know about the science and the art behind fire and all the different liabilities. But that lead burn instructor group has been, I guess, created from the very beginning of when we have our certified and insured prescribed burn manager. So if any of y'all are familiar with Dr. Charles Butch Taylor, he was pretty instrumental in creating the lead burn instructor certification program. Now, there are specific requirements for our LBIs, and their application does get reviewed for by the Prescribed Burn Board from the state of Texas Department of Agriculture Burn Board. And we definitely aren't the, I guess, shining star of an example. There's been a lot of lessons learned from being within that group. Definitely communication is one, meeting frequently is one, delivering timely information out to our certified and insured prescribed burn managers is key. Keeping up with laws and regs so you're teaching the most current content is absolutely crucial. But it has provided us a universal platform of curriculum that goes east to west, north to south from Texas. So it doesn't matter if you're burning in Piney Woods or if you're burning in Tallgrass, Prairie, and up in the Panhandle, wherever you may be, that curriculum stays the same, and it's well represented from various lead burn instructors across the state. And Andy, if you've got anything you'd like to add on that, I'd welcome your comments in the chat and also online if you want to.
Yeah, and I can speak for the Southeast just a little bit. I'm not sure where folks are calling in from today, but maybe other people, yeah, if anybody wants to chime in the chat what your state does. But at least in the Southeast, all of our certified prescribed burn manager programs are run through our state forestry agencies. And so most of the trainers who are the ones, the people who are giving the certification are also the ones doing the training, and most of them do work for the state forestry agency. However, that being said, some states like Alabama also will contract with people who have a lot of burning experience and experience in training and are certified burn managers themselves. And then, in some states, they'll also pull in people who are certified burn managers themselves. So the people who have taken the course and have gone through their course. In North Carolina, we have to do that checkoff burn where you have to get a checkoff burn by another certified burn manager. It could be somebody in your PBA, it could be, you know, as long as it's another certified burn manager, anybody has the, because the going back to capacity, the capacity wasn't there for the Forest Service to be certifying every single person. We're over 1,000, if not a couple thousand people who are certified burners in our state at this point. So they opened up the opportunity for any certified burner to be able to check off somebody else's certification burn, but the training itself is still led by the agencies in most cases, except for where they contract somebody else. But outside of our, you know, looking at non-certification type training, really it's just anybody with experience and knowledge on that topic. There's no background check, I guess, on some of those things. But obviously, you wouldn't want to be training somebody else in a topic that you're not familiar with. So, yeah, anybody could be pulled in for some of those, and we will pull in other landowners and other certified burners and people who have gone through the training before to kind of help out with those trainings sometimes to share their experiences as well.
Well, thank you. There's a ton of experience there. And Brian, I know this was a pretty new question, so I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't have anything else to compare or contrast, but if, feel free to jump in if you have anything else.
Yeah, just, I mean, from Nebraska standpoint, we don't have a, certified burner program or any kind of certification. Most of the training that is done by us and our partners, we basically are kind of like self-selecting, like, okay, we feel that you're competent enough and know enough about fire that you can teach these classes, like basic classes and stuff like that. But we don't have any kind of process to certified instructors. I'm not sure that we would do that unless we had some sort of like certification process, and I don't think we'd have a certification process unless we get something out of it necessarily. I think we're kind of self-policing at this point. And I think our landowners, and I know the landowners on our board of fire council are wanting to maintain that currently. So we'll see how long that lasts with every state surrounding us probably going to it, but as of now, we don't have a certification process.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate all the different experiences you have to bring to the table there. It looks like a lot of the questions in chat are being answered by other people in the chat, so that's great. And some of the questions that came in through registration were hit on here through the conversation. So we just have a few minutes left, and we've covered a lot of ground. So I also wanted to make sure everyone had a minute or two if you wanted to share a main point for folks before they're logging off of the webinar, and we'll go from there.
I might add just one quick little ending note or whatever, but I think it's so important for these webinars just to be organized and plugged into, because as you scale out and look at all these names that are on this list, this is not just a network, this is a force. And so when we start trying to organize or get ahead of litigation or regulation, or get organized before we're forced to organize, I think this is that baseline foundation that you can reach out to and lean on one another of what, common experience or general prescribed fire experience from state to state, region to region, what we're dealing with. I think, sometimes I get worried that if our network isn't growing and expanding, then we're just going to erode away. But as I look at all these different names, and I think we were up to 60 some participants on here, Craig. That's just incredible. And I think our ability to come together and collectively talk about these issues and realize that we're not alone in our little silos of what it is we're working on, or local challenges. We've got a team, we've got a bench, we've got a force, and it's really, really cool to see all these names and states and regions represented. And thank you for all your conversations that you're doing. I know probably there was nothing new learned today. But I think just the realization that there's all of these names on this webinar is really, really cool and somewhat inspiring too. So thank you for organizing, Craig and Lori, and for making it happen.
Yeah, thank you for being a part of this. It's been really fun to get connected with all the expertise out there.
Yeah, well said, Morgan. Inspiring is a good word. It's great to see all these folks. And I guess I would just add, part of capacity to me is thinking about long-term sustainability for this stuff. So capacity is also about the ability to maintain our prescribed burning efforts over time. It's not just a one-off situation, right? So as we're continuing to put on these trainings and trying to build capacity, thinking about the investment in the people and the resources and how can we sustain this over time. I even just saw the comment in the chat about we're losing many of our commercial prescribed burn managers because of litigation and insurance, you know, thinking about those sorts of things and keeping prescribed burn associations sustained and keeping as many people as possible, because we can't afford to lose capacity, right? We have to be thinking about how can we at the very least maintain, but hopefully continue to increase capacity over time.
Yeah, I'd echo both of those, and I think our need for fire is only going to get more and more every year, and the realization is that the ability to put fire on the landscape might also be getting harder every year. So, you know, making sure that we're able to do that for the land and for our people is really important. And like Morgan, you know, all these people, you know, getting ahead of it, making sure that we're able to manage our land the way we need to in the future is really important. So
All right, well, thank you. I'm gonna try to get through the conclusion here without coughing. So I just wanted to add, we are going to work on summarizing this as well, because I know there's lots of different dimensions here, and so there's some lessons learned that are going to be more relevant for people who are new to this, but then I think there are also some great nuggets and connections for people who are more advanced. So I know a 90-minute webinar is a lot to take in, and we want to make sure this is a little more digestible for folks. And so that's one of the products that will be coming out of this as well. But thank you so much, Jen, Morgan, and Brian. This was a really awesome discussion, as we've all hit on. I also wanted to thank Lori Bamerlin and Carol Baldwin at the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange. They definitely helped make this webinar series possible, and it's a team effort. And again, lots of great participation on the chat today. Thanks for everyone who is able to join. This will be posted on YouTube as well, so please feel free to forward that to folks you think would be interested in this content.